Silence is not merely the absence of sound, but a living presence, a force capable of transforming souls. In a world where empty words echo endlessly, there is power in what is left unsaid. This is the story of how silence can become the deepest of masters. In the misty mountains, where the sky meets the earth and the clouds embrace ancient peaks, stood a monastery of stone darkened by time. Its thick walls guarded not only the monks who lived there, but also centuries-old secrets, teachings passed down from generation to generation. The wind whispered through the pines surrounding the temple, creating a natural melody that complemented the morning chants. Among the inhabitants of this sacred refuge, one stood out not for what he said, but for what he did not say. The old monk, bent by the weight of years yet firm in his steps, moved through the polished wooden corridors as if floating a few inches above the ground. His wrinkled hands spoke of a life of constant work. His deep eyes, two pools of crystal-clear water, seemed to see beyond appearances, beyond the present moment. For decades, no one in the monastery had heard his voice. The younger novices often speculated whether he even possessed the gift of speech. Some whispered, when they thought they were alone, that perhaps he had been mute since birth. Others, more imaginative, suggested that some great tragedy had sealed his lips forever. The older monks, however, knew the truth. They spoke in hushed voices of how, in his youth, the old monk had not only been talkative, but a brilliant orator. It was said that he had mastered all the sutras, that his voice resonated like a temple bell during philosophical debates. He could recite entire passages from the most complex teachings by heart, explaining them with a clarity that impressed even the most erudite masters. The change had come after a pilgrimage to distant mountains, where it was said the Buddha himself had once meditated. The young monk, then in his 30s, had left speaking and returned in complete silence. He took no formal vows, made no announcement of his decision. He simply stopped talking, like one who closes a book after finishing its final page. At first, others tried to make him speak again. The abbot of the monastery summoned him several times, attempting to understand his choice. Respected masters sought to engage him in debates, hoping that his passion for knowledge would rekindle his voice. Nothing worked. As the years passed, the silence that at first seemed like a phase became as much a part of him as the blood in his veins. What impressed everyone the most was not just his silence, but how he used it. He never seemed frustrated by his inability to express himself with words. His precise gestures, his attentive gaze, the way he tilted his head slightly when listening, all communicated with a clarity that words often fail to achieve. There was an old story known to everyone in the monastery about the day when the Buddha, instead of giving a sermon, simply held up a flower before his disciples. Confused, they waited for words of wisdom, for deep explanations. Only one disciple, named Mahakasyapa, understood the gesture. He smiled, recognizing the truth that transcends explanations. At that moment, tradition says, enlightenment blossomed in his heart, like the very flower in the Buddha's hands. The silent old monk did not merely know this story. He seemed to live it in every moment. His silence was not a denial of communication, but the choice of a deeper language. In his daily routine, he woke before everyone else, when the stars still shone in the sky. Without making a sound, he lit a small candle and meditated for a full hour, as still as the mountains surrounding the monastery. Then, while the others still slept, he began his tasks. He swept the long corridors with fluid movements, as if each stroke of the broom were a silent prayer. He cleaned the main hall where everyone gathered for meals, arranged the altars with fresh offerings, and ensured that everything was in perfect order before the first bell rang. When the other monks descended for morning prayers, they found everything ready, as if benevolent spirits had done the work overnight. Few noticed the old monk sitting quietly in a corner, almost invisible, observing with serenity. Once a month, when lay visitors came to the monastery seeking blessings or advice, the old monk remained apart, not out of disdain or lack of compassion, but because he understood that his silence might be misinterpreted by those unaccustomed to the ways of the monastery. Only when a visitor displayed deep suffering, a pain that words could not comfort, would the abbot call for him. In those rare moments, the old monk would simply sit before the person in pain, breathe with them, sharing his silence as a precious gift. Many later said they had never felt so deeply understood. A persistent legend in the monastery told of a famous general, known for his cruelty in battle, who had once visited the temple. Arrogant and accustomed to being feared, he demanded that the wise monk he had heard so much about provide him with an amulet of protection for his next war. When the abbot explained that the wisest monk among them had chosen silence, the general flew into a rage, threatening to burn down the monastery if his request was not met. Summoned before the furious military leader, the old monk merely sat, as silent as ever. The general shouted, demanded, threatened. The monk remained impassive. Gradually, something strange happened. The warrior's face, twisted in anger, began to relax. His breathing, once short and rapid, grew deeper. Finally, to the astonishment of all present, silent tears began to stream down his battle-scarred face. The general knelt, bowed his forehead to the ground, and left without another word. Weeks later, he sent a messenger with news that he had laid down his arms and begun a life of service to the poor. Perhaps it was just a legend, exaggerated over the years. Or perhaps there was a profound truth in it about the power that genuine silence holds over souls disturbed by inner noise. In the early afternoons, while the other monks rested or studied, the old monk would retreat to the back of the monastery. There, in a small stone chamber darkened by time, stood a heavy stone mill used to grind rice. It was grueling work that many avoided hours of repetitive effort in a stifling space, turning the massive circular stone, filling sacks with the milled rice that would feed the entire community. The old monk had tended to the rice mill for so long that the stone floor bore faint marks where his feet always stood. What others might find monotonous and exhausting was, for him, a sacred ritual. Every movement, every breath, every grain ground, each was performed with total attention, as if the entire universe were contained within the simple act of milling. Ancient Buddhist texts say that the path to enlightenment lies in the simplest gestures of daily life. When you are hungry, eat. When you are tired, sleep. This Zen teaching, seemingly trivial, holds a profound truth that few truly manage to practice. To be completely present, without dividing the mind between past and future, may be the greatest challenge we face as human beings. In the stifling heat of the small grinding room, the old monk embodied this truth. His calloused hands moved the heavy millstone in perfect circles, neither too fast nor too slow, only at the right pace. Sweat trickled down his temples, forming small streams that disappeared into the worn collar of his brown robe. His face showed neither discomfort nor pleasure, only complete acceptance of the present moment. Raw rice slowly entered through the central opening of the upper stone and emerged at the edges as a fine powder, which he carefully collected in thick cloth sacks. The flour that fed all the monastery's brothers passed through his hands day after day, year after year. How many millions of grains had been transformed by his silent touch over the decades? Impossible to count. On the stone walls of the room, white stains had formed, the rice dust accumulating over time, creating irregular patterns like frozen clouds. The floor was always impeccably clean, swept several times a day with the same care one would dedicate to an altar. For the old monk, there was no distinction between the sacred and the mundane. The mill was his temple, the rice his offering, the act of grinding his prayer. One of Zen's most well-known stories tells of a disciple who once asked his master, "What is the Buddha?" The master replied, 3 pounds of flax. To the intellect that seeks lofty meanings, the answer seems absurd, but the old monk understood its truth perfectly. Ultimate reality is not beyond ordinary things, but precisely within them, when seen with clarity. 3 pounds of rice are 3 pounds of rice, and they contain the whole truth of the universe. One morning, as he worked, the old monk noticed a tiny ant struggling to carry a fallen grain of rice. The insect, many times smaller than its burden, dragged it with heroic determination. The monk paused and watched for a few minutes. Then, gently, he lowered a finger into the ant's path, offering a bridge to ease its journey. The small creature accepted the help without hesitation, crossing over the monk's wrinkled skin as if it were part of the natural path. A barely perceptible smile touched the old man's lips. In that simple moment lay a lesson that many seek for entire lifetimes: the interconnectedness of all beings. On the hottest of summer afternoons, when the air inside the grinding room became almost unbreathable, the old monk would occasionally stop for a few moments. Not out of exhaustion, but out of compassion for himself, a necessary pause to allow his body to adjust. In those moments, he would sit in the lotus position beside the mill and close his eyes. His breath, which had previously followed the rhythm of his work, would find its own natural flow. Deep, slow, present. The younger monks were allowed to assist in all the monastery's tasks, from cleaning the latrines to preparing the most sacred ceremonies, all except for milling the rice. For some unexplained reason, the abbot had assigned this duty solely to the silent old monk. Some believed it was a punishment for some long-forgotten mistake. Others thought it was a privilege, an honor reserved only for him. The truth, known only to the abbot and the old monk, was much simpler. Years ago, when the abbot was still a young monk filled with doubts, he had faced a deep crisis of faith. For entire nights, tormented by unanswerable questions, he wandered the monastery halls while others slept. It was on one of these nights that he discovered the then not-so-old monk in the grinding room. Watching him work with absolute concentration, something shifted in the young monk's heart. The answers he had sought in complex texts and exhaustive meditations appeared there, in the simplicity of a man grinding rice as if nothing else in the world mattered. They were not intellectual answers, but rather the dissolution of the questions themselves in the clear water of direct experience. When he became abbot years later, he never interfered with this routine. He understood that the solitary work in the grinding room was not a task assigned to the old monk. It was his own form of meditation, his personal path to truth. During the rainy seasons, when the humidity made milling even more difficult, the old monk took special care. Damp rice tended to stick to the stones, requiring more strength and attention. He adjusted his movements, modified the pressure, and found the right rhythm for the new conditions. This flexibility within routine demonstrated another fundamental teaching. Rigidity breaks under pressure, while adaptability allows perseverance. An ancient Buddhist text compares the mind to a mill. Thoughts are like grains that arrive constantly. You can let them pass without clinging, transforming them into useful nourishment. The old monk did not merely know this teaching, he embodied it, quite literally, every day. Each grain process was like a thought recognized and released, without attachment or aversion. After hours of continuous work, when the sacks of milled rice had piled up in a corner of the room, the old monk finally concluded his daily task at the mill. With the same care he had shown at the start, he meticulously cleaned every part of the equipment. The stone was cleared of any residue, the floor swept, the tools organized. Nothing was left to chance or done in haste. An attentive observer would notice that this final cleaning took almost as much time as the grinding itself. The old monk treated the closing of the task with the same reverence as its beginning, understanding that endings are just as important as beginnings. In a world where people rush from one activity to the next without properly honoring the closure of the previous one, this was yet another silent lesson he offered. Over the years, the small grinding room had become more than just a workplace for the old monk. It was his sanctuary, a space where the noise of the outside world did not penetrate, where the stone walls absorbed both sound and restlessness. The other monks rarely ventured there. There was no formal prohibition, but a silent understanding that the space belonged to him, not by possession, but by spiritual affinity. When someone occasionally needed to fetch a sack of milled rice or leave a message, they would enter with the reverence of one visiting a temple within the temple. The room's lighting came from a single narrow window, positioned in such a way that a ray of sunlight entered directly at noon. During that brief moment, tiny rice dust particles danced in the air like luminous beings. Without interrupting his work, the old monk witnessed this daily spectacle as a reminder of the impermanence and beauty of all things. Tomorrow, the sun would be there again, but never in exactly the same way, never illuminating the same particles. On the walls of the room, damp stains had formed patterns that to keen eyes resembled the ink blots of Zen paintings called sumi-e. A large stain near the ceiling looked like a distant mountain shrouded in mist. Another, closer to the floor, resembled a tranquil lake. The old monk never tried to clean or cover them. He saw in these spontaneous formations the same beauty he found in the carefully crafted paintings of artists. An old story tells of a disciple who asked his master, "What is the nature of Buddha?" The master replied, "The cypress in the garden." Confused, the disciple pressed for a clearer explanation. The master simply repeated, "The cypress in the garden." For the old monk, the stains on the wall, the creaking of the millstone, the smell of freshly milled rice, all of these were the answers to great questions. There was no need to seek transcendent truths beyond what was directly present. During winter, when the air turned sharp with cold, the grinding room offered a paradoxical comfort. The physical work generated enough heat to warm the small space, and the old monk moved at a slightly quicker pace, not out of impatience, but as a natural adaptation to his body's needs. At times, a small cloud of vapor formed around his head as he worked, his warm breath meeting the cold air. There were times of the year when the workload increased considerably, especially before major ceremonies or when groups of pilgrims visited the monastery. During these periods, the old monk spent extra hours at the mill without a single sign of complaint. His face maintained the same serene expression, his hands the same meticulous care, regardless of the amount of rice to be processed. Once, during an especially intense period of work, a violent storm struck the region. Torrential rain seeped through the old roof, forming puddles on the stone floor. Without interrupting his task, the old monk simply adjusted his position to avoid the dripping water. When the abbot learned of the situation, he immediately sent monks to repair the roof, but they encountered unexpected resistance. With clear yet gentle gestures, the old monk dismissed them. He wanted to continue his work storm or not. Respecting his autonomy, the abbot ordered the monks to withdraw. Later, when questioned about his decision, he explained, "To most of us, rain is an inconvenience that disrupts our tasks. To him, it is simply another aspect of reality to be accepted. Who are we to deny him that lesson?" The next morning, after the storm had passed, the old monk was found sleeping upright beside the mill, completely soaked, with all the sacks of rice protected under an improvised cover. He had worked through the night to make up for lost time, ensuring that the community would not go without food. When he awoke and realized he was being observed, he simply bowed his head in a humble gesture and resumed his work as if nothing extraordinary had happened. This incident only deepened the respect the other monks had for him. It was not admiration based on wise words or special knowledge, but on the simplicity of his daily devotion. As an old Zen proverb says, Before enlightenment, chop wood and carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood and carry water. The difference lies in the awareness with which the task is performed. The rhythmic sound of stone grinding against stone became part of the monastery soundscape. Some of the more sensitive monks could tell, just by the sound, whether the work was being done by the old monk or by a rare substitute when he fell ill. There was a different quality to it, a consistency that only decades of practice could produce. As the seasons passed, the old monk's body seemed to merge more and more with his daily task. His arms, despite his advanced age, retained the strength necessary to move the heavy stone. His hands, covered in calluses that resembled the texture of the very rice he milled, moved with automatic precision. His back, slightly curved by the years, found the perfect angle to apply force without strain. Teachings say that the human body is like a borrowed vehicle, used during our journey and returned when it ends. The old monk treated his body with this understanding, neither with excessive indulgence nor with neglect. He maintained it as a skilled craftsman maintains his tools, clean, well cared for, neither more nor less than necessary to fulfill its function. One spring morning, as cherry blossoms bloomed around the monastery, a small squirrel entered through the narrow window of the grinding room. The animal, curious and hungry, was drawn by the scent of rice. The old monk paused his work and watched the little visitor with calm interest. Instead of shooing it away, he sat still, allowing the squirrel to explore. The tiny creature approached cautiously, sniffing the air, assessing the danger. After a few minutes of mutual recognition, the old monk slowly extended his hand, offering a few grains of rice in his open palm. The squirrel, hesitant at first, eventually accepted the offering, taking one grain, then another. This silent interaction lasted a little over half an hour. No words were spoken, no attempt at domestication was made. Just two beings briefly sharing the same space, each recognizing the existence of the other. When the squirrel finally left through the same window it had entered, the old monk resumed his work as if the pause had been a natural part of the process. In the weeks that followed, the squirrel returned regularly, sometimes alone, sometimes accompanied by others. The old monk never altered his routine to accommodate them, nor did he create expectations about their visits. He welcomed them when they came, accepted their absence when they did not. This relationship, free of attachments or demands, was yet another manifestation of his deep understanding of the nature of existence. The spring of that year brought a new group of novices to the monastery, young men who, for various reasons, had chosen the spiritual path. Among them stood out a young man of about 20, with restless eyes that never seemed to settle on a single point. Born and raised in the hustle and bustle of a big city, the young monk carried with him the fast-paced rhythm of the outside world. His movements were abrupt, his breathing short and hurried. Even dressed in the same simple robes as the others, he seemed out of place, as if his clothes constrained him, as if the silence of the monastery were an invisible prison. During the morning meditations, while the others remained motionless like statues, he constantly shifted positions. A sore knee, a tingling foot, an itch on his face, his body seemed to conspire against stillness. But it was his mind that was the true battlefield. Thoughts cascaded through him. Memories of the past, worries about the future, doubts about his decision to come to the monastery, plans for when, not if, he decided to leave. The abbot, a wise and compassionate man, had noticed his struggle. After a particularly difficult session, he called the young monk for a private conversation. "What is the hardest challenge you face here?" he asked gently. Grateful for the opportunity to express himself, the young man let his words flow like a broken dam. He spoke of the oppressive silence, the endless hours of meditation, the slowness that seemed to dominate every aspect of monastery life. "My mind won't stop," he concluded. It's like trying to trap a swarm of bees in a box that's too small. The abbot listened attentively, never interrupting. When the torrent of words finally subsided, he simply said, "The Dhammapada teaches us, the mind is hard to control, fickle and capricious. It lands wherever it wishes. It is good to discipline it. A disciplined mind brings happiness. Do not worry, young brother. You are not the first to face this battle, nor will you be the last. You will find your way." The young monk had expected specific instructions, meditation techniques, perhaps even an exemption from some practices. The abbot's vague response only frustrated him further. "How can I find my way if I don't even know where to start?" he thought as he left the abbot's office. That night, unable to sleep, he left his dormitory and wandered through the monastery corridors. The full moon bathed the courtyards in silver light, transforming the familiar setting into something almost mystical. With no particular destination in mind, he wandered into areas he rarely visited during the day. That was when he heard a rhythmic, steady sound coming from a small building at the far end of the monastery grounds. Curious, he approached silently. Through the crack of a slightly open door, he saw the flickering glow of a lamp. Peeking inside, he witnessed a scene that deeply intrigued him. The silent old monk, a mysterious figure whom everyone seemed to respect but whom he had barely noticed until then, was bent over a stone mill. With fluid, steady movements, he turned the heavy circular stone, grinding rice grains into flour. His face, partially illuminated by the lamplight, bore a serenity the young monk had never seen before. Fascinated, the young man stood still, watching. What impressed him most was not the task itself, but the quality of presence emanating from the old monk. It was as if nothing else existed for him beyond that moment, that stone, those grains. There were no signs of boredom or impatience, no indication that he wished to be anywhere else or doing anything else. After nearly an hour of silent observation, the young monk withdrew quietly, afraid of being discovered. He returned to his dormitory with a storm of thoughts. How could someone find peace in such a monotonous task? What was it about that old man that allowed him such contentment? Was it some kind of mental trick, a secret technique? The following night, he returned to the milling room. Once again, the old monk was there, as if he had never moved since the previous night. This time, the young monk noticed details he had missed before. The old man's breathing, perfectly synchronized with the movement of the stone. His hands, which seemed to know every inch of the mill intimately. The almost tangible atmosphere of tranquility that filled the small space. Without realizing it, the young monk's nighttime vigils became a ritual. After the day's activities, he would wait for everyone to fall asleep before sneaking to his usual observation post. Never at the same time, sometimes in the middle of the night, other times just before dawn, but the old monk was always there, grinding rice with the same serene dedication. An old Buddhist story tells of a disciple who asked his master, "How do I practice the Dharma in daily life?" The master replied, "When you eat, just eat. When you walk, just walk." This answer, which had once seemed absurdly simple to the young monk, now began to reveal deeper layers of meaning. Slowly, something began to change in the young observer. First, he noticed that his meditation sessions became less torturous. There was still mental restlessness, but now there were also unexpected moments of calm. During meals, he occasionally caught himself truly savoring the rice instead of simply swallowing it down in haste. In his daily tasks, sweeping the courtyard, washing clothes, cleaning the meditation hall, he began to unconsciously mimic the quality of attention he had witnessed in the old monk. Not because he was trying to, but because the image of that serene concentration had etched itself into his mind as a silent ideal. One particularly cold night, the young monk arrived early at the milling room. Taking his usual hiding spot, he prepared for another few hours of silent observation. But something unusual happened. The old monk, without stopping his work or even looking in his direction, raised his hand in a small gesture like someone acknowledging the presence of a friend. The young monk's heart raced. He had been discovered. His first instinct was to flee, embarrassed by his spying. But something kept him rooted to the spot, caught between fear and curiosity. The old monk made no further gestures, simply continuing his work as if nothing had happened. After a few moments of internal turmoil, the young monk understood. The old man had probably known of his presence from the very beginning, perhaps from the very first night. This realization brought a mix of embarrassment and relief. Without fully knowing why, the young monk stepped out of his hiding place and entered the room completely. The young monk stood frozen at the entrance of the room, his body tense like an over-tightened violin string. The old man, on the other hand, continued his work as if nothing extraordinary was happening. There were no words of reprimand, not even a questioning glance. Only the steady movement of the stone and the soft rustling of grains being ground in the flour. After several minutes of hesitation, the young monk finally took a few steps inside. The air was thick with the distinctive aroma of milled rice, an earthy, slightly sweet fragrance. The temperature was higher than in the hallway, a result of the continuous labor and the confined space. Beads of sweat glistened on the old monk's forehead, reflecting the golden light of the oil lamp. The young monk didn't know what to do or say. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind countless times, imagining how he would explain himself if caught. But now, faced with reality, every word seemed inadequate. To his surprise, the silence was neither oppressive nor accusatory. It was simply space to be, to breathe, to perceive. Without thinking too much, he sat on a small wooden stool in the corner of the room. From there, he could observe the old monk's work more fully than he had through the crack in the door. He saw how the entire body participated in the motion, not just the arms. How the old man's feet were firmly planted on the ground. How his spine remained aligned despite the curvature of age. How his breath flowed naturally, without effort or conscious control. 2 hours passed in complete silence. The young monk had expected to feel boredom, impatience, the urge to move or speak. Instead, he experienced something entirely new in inner stillness that did not come from forcibly suppressing his thoughts, but from a natural attention to the present moment. The thoughts still arose, but they no longer carried him away as they once did. They were like clouds drifting across the sky, observed without attachment or identification. As dawn began to announce itself with its bluish light filtering through the small window, the old monk finally stopped. Carefully, he covered the mill with a clean cloth, arranged the sacks of flour into a neat pile, and extinguished the lamp. Then, for the first time, he looked directly at the young monk. There was no curiosity in his gaze, no judgment, only a quiet acknowledgement of the other's existence. With a slight nod, the old man turned toward the door. Before leaving, he made an almost imperceptible gesture with his hand, as if inviting the young monk to return whenever he wished. Then he disappeared silently into the corridor, leaving the young monk alone with his swirling thoughts. In the weeks that followed, an unspoken routine took shape. Almost every night, the young monk appeared in the milling room. Sometimes he stayed for only an hour. Other times, he remained until dawn, always sitting in silence, always observing, absorbing that wordless lesson on presence and dedication. One night, nature decided to test this silent partnership. A fierce storm descended from the mountains with unexpected fury. The wind howled through the monastery corridors like a wild beast, and the rain pounded mercilessly against the ancient roof. The young monk hesitated before making his usual nighttime visit. The storm had made the outer passages treacherous, and parts of the monastery were already in darkness due to the wind extinguishing the lamps. Still, he felt compelled to go, as if bound by a commitment he could not break. When he finally reached the milling room, he found a scene of chaos. Part of the roof had collapsed under the force of the storm, and rain was pouring in freely, soaking the stone floor. The old monk moved quickly, an urgency the young man had never seen in him before, trying to protect the sacks of rice and flour with pieces of cloth and wooden boards. Without hesitation, the young monk stepped fully into the room. His eyes met the old monk's for a brief moment, and in that look, there was something new. Surprise, perhaps even relief. Without the need for words or instructions, the young monk immediately understood what needed to be done. With renewed energy, he began moving the sacks to the driest part of the room. The old monk, realizing his intention, focused on improvising a cover for the hole in the roof. They worked in perfect sync, as if they had rehearsed this dance many times before. The rain intensified, turning into hail that drummed violently against the walls. The wind grew stronger, threatening to tear down the makeshift structure the old monk had built. In a critical moment, when everything seemed on the verge of collapse, the young monk instinctively climbed onto a stack of sacks and stretched out, his arms to hold a swaying beam while the old monk secured it tightly with a rope. For hours, they fought against the elements. Water streamed down their faces. Their clothes were soaked. Their muscles ached from the unusual strain. But at no point was there despair or defeat in their eyes, only focused determination and complete presence in the task at hand. Buddhist philosophy teaches about the interdependence of all things. Nothing exists in isolation. Everything is connected in an infinite web of causal relationships. That abstract truth manifested itself concretely on that stormy night. Young and old, inexperience and wisdom, physical strength and technical knowledge, they complemented each other perfectly, each offering exactly what the other needed. By the early hours of the morning, when the storm finally softened into a gentle rain, they had managed to save almost all of the rice supply. The floor was flooded. Parts of the roof remained exposed, but the essential, the food that would sustain the community, was safe. Exhausted, they sat side by side on the only dry sacks left. Their breathing gradually synchronized into the same rhythm, deep and steady. There was no need for congratulations or thanks. The work they had done together spoke for itself. As the first rays of sunlight pierced through the retreating clouds, illuminating the room through the gaps in the roof, the old monk turned to the young one. For the first time since they had met, a genuine smile lit up his wrinkled face. It was a smile that conveyed not just gratitude, but recognition, the recognition of a kindred spirit, of a soul that, despite all external differences, resonated at the same essential frequency as his own. After the night of the storm, something fundamental had changed in the relationship between the young and the old monk. There were no more secrets, no distance, no invisible hierarchy that once separated them. The shared labor under the pressure of the elements had forged a bond that transcended words, age, and experience. In the following mornings, when the other monks discovered the damage caused by the storm, a communal effort was organized to repair the roof of the milling hall. The young monk participated actively, surprising everyone with his detailed knowledge of the place and his unusual dedication to the task. Some noticed, with curiosity, the silent communication that seemed to exist between him and the old monk at a glance, a subtle gesture, a harmony that required no verbal explanations. The abbot, observing this transformation with keen eyes, smiled to himself. For years, he had hoped that someone younger would draw closer to the silent old monk, absorbing some of his wisdom before it was too late. The Dharma is transmitted like one lamp lighting another, he thought, recalling the ancient teaching. The flame passes on without diminishing its own light. Once the repairs were completed, the monastery's routine resumed its normal flow. But for the young monk, nothing was the same as before. The morning meditations, which had once felt like endless torture, now flowed with surprising ease. His body found the correct posture without conscious effort. His breath deepened on its own. And his mind, though still active, no longer dragged him into uncontrollable whirlwinds of thought. During communal meals, he discovered the joy of truly savoring each bite of rice, now knowing it had been milled with such care. The textures, the flavors, the aroma, everything took on a new dimension when experienced with full awareness. When you eat, just eat. The Zen teaching that had once seemed trivial now revealed profound layers of meaning. In the daily tasks assigned to him, whether sweeping the courtyard, cleaning the bathrooms, or working in the vegetable garden, he brought the same quality of presence he had witnessed in the old monk. Not through conscious imitation, but because something of that way of being had naturally permeated his own existence. At night, he continued to visit the milling hall, but now, no longer as a shadowed observer, but as an active participant. At first, he merely assisted with small tasks, sweeping the floor, organizing sacks, bringing fresh water. Over time, the old monk began teaching him how to operate the mill itself. His young hands, accustomed to quick and efficient movements, had to learn a new rhythm. The millstone did not respond well to brute force or haste. It required a delicate balance between firmness and gentleness, constant attention to the resistance of the grain, continuous adaptation as the process unfolded. There were frustrations, of course. On one occasion, the young monk applied too much force and slightly damaged the edge of the stone. On another, his attention wavered, and he spilled an entire sack of freshly milled rice. But the old monk never showed impatience or disappointment. He accepted mistakes as a natural part of learning, corrected them with gentle gestures, and continued his work with the same unshaken serenity. During the autumn festival, when the monastery opened its doors to visitors from the nearby village, a curious incident occurred. A businessman from the city, known for his sharp tongue and arrogant manners, was visiting the monastery for the first time. After observing the monks for a while, he approached the young one with a disdainful smile. "So," he said loudly, "you spend your days milling rice with that mute old man? What a waste of youth. What could you possibly learn from someone who doesn't even speak?" The young monk, who months ago would have felt provoked or compelled to defend himself, simply smiled. After a moment of silence, he replied in a calm voice, "When you meet someone capable of conveying the deepest truths without uttering a word, you begin to realize how much time we waste on empty words." The man had no response, his derisive smile gradually fading. Something in the serene presence of the young monk, in the quiet clarity of his gaze, touched him in an unexpected way. He walked away, pensive, like someone who had just encountered a question he was not prepared to answer. Spring and autumn followed one another. The young monk was no longer so young, and the old monk grew more bent with each passing winter. Their silent partnership in the milling hall became an institution in the monastery, the guardians of the rice, as some respectfully called them. One winter morning, as the first snowflakes began to fall, the young man, now in middle age, headed to the milling hall as usual. The old monk was not in his usual place. Concerned, he searched for him in the dormitory, but his bed was neatly arranged and empty. Following an inexplicable instinct, he returned to the milling hall and looked more closely. The old monk was there, seated in meditation in the quietest corner of the room, his back resting against the stone wall, his eyes closed, his face as serene as ever. But his chest no longer moved with the rhythm of breath. He had passed away during the night, alone and in silence, exactly as he had lived. In his hands rested a small cloth sack containing freshly milled rice, his final task, completed before sitting for his last rest. The middle-aged monk felt no despair or overwhelming sorrow, only a deep understanding of the impermanence that the Buddha had taught. All conditioned things are subject to dissolution, he recalled. Practice diligently. In the days that followed, he naturally took full responsibility for milling the rice. There was no formal ceremony of succession, no public announcement, only the silent continuity of an essential task. Other monks noticed a subtle change in him. Always calm and centered before, now he radiated a presence that seemed to fill the spaces he passed through. And though he had never taken a formal vow of silence, his words became increasingly rare and precise, like dewdrops on a lotus leaf, each one perfectly formed, each reflecting the entire universe. Years later, a new group of novices arrived at the monastery. Among them was a particularly restless young man, whose eyes never seemed to settle on a single point. During meditations, he fidgeted constantly, his face an open book of frustration and impatience. One night, unable to sleep, this young novice wandered through the monastery's corridors. With no specific destination, his steps led him to a small building at the back of the complex. Through the crack of a slightly open door, he saw the flickering light of a lamp. Peeking inside, he observed a middle-aged monk slowly turning a millstone, transforming grains of rice into flour with fluid, precise movements. Something about that scene captivated him completely. There was a quality of presence, of totality, that he had never witnessed before. The monk worked as if nothing else existed beyond that moment, that task, that circular movement of stone upon stone. The cycle had completed itself. The flame had passed on, not diminished, but amplified. And the power of silence, that transformative force that shapes souls without words, had found a new channel through which to flow across generations.